So I'd like to start with a few words on IPCC, because that's probably where the actuality lies today. Since last week, or not last week, the week before, we were in Busan, Korea, for a very important IPCC plenary, which was the first IPCC meeting after the IAC report, which is the report of the Inter-Academic Council, which was set up by the UN Secretary General and the chair of the IPCC at the beginning of the spring, in order to review the procedures and the manner by which the IPCC is working to see if some things can be improved in order to reduce the probability that further mistakes, such as the Himalayan glacier mistake, would take place. After having covered that, I'll then see how far I can go covering, I would say once more, because I have done that many times over the last 3 years, the content of the last IPCC report, trying to show how, even if it's a report dating from 3 years ago, it is still highly relevant to the context of the climate negotiations that will take place in Cancun, Mexico, at the end of November, beginning of December. So first, I think it's important to remember why the IPCC was created. You know, there have been many controversies and discussions about whether, you know, human activities are really causing climate change, whether it's important or not in terms of consequences, etc. And some might have the impression, reading some media these days, that the controversy started, I have the impression, my microphone, it's back, started just a year ago when the ClimateGate publication, the so-called ClimateGate, the publication of those emails from the Climate Research Unit at the University of East Anglia. Actually, there were controversies 25 years ago as well, and this is precisely the reason why the IPCC was created, because there was 25 years ago a quite good understanding by many policymakers and high-level officials of the science behind the warming of climate and of the importance of the consequences that this might have. But there were controversies, and the way they found to help clarify those controversies and help giving policymakers at the international level and national level the best scientific foundation to take any decision, they created a body which is not an additional body to do research on climate change, but which is quite unique actually. It is a body which is tasked with assessing the state of knowledge about climate change in the most objective manner. And looking at all dimensions of the climate problem, as much the the purely scientific aspects related to the climate system, as the consequences on ecosystems, human health, the economy, all the sectors that might be impacted by climate change, and also look, once the causes of this recent climate change have been identified, at solutions or elements of solutions which could help preventing some of those damages. This plot shows an important reason why the IPCC is actually so much needed, and was actually well needed 25 years ago, but is even more needed today. If the IPCC wasn't there, and I'm sure this would plead some persons or some groups of persons, or maybe some countries, the policymakers would be left facing this totally unmanageable amount of separate pieces of information. published in the scientific or in the technical literature. I mean, thousands, literally thousands of articles per year. And if you don't have a body which assesses the quality of those pieces of information and the coherence of that amount of information and draws some synthesis and conclusions and options, at least, for action, then how could the policymakers reasonably do something that's well-founded? It would be much more difficult than with the Ipcc existing. So that's why in December of 1988, the UN General Assembly tasked this new panel, this intergovernmental, and the word intergovernmental is important, I'll come back to it, panel on climate change, to provide international coordinated scientific assessment on the magnitude, timing, and potential and socioeconomic impact of climate change, and also realistic response strategies. So the Ipcc is now 22-year-old, and it's very clear that it doesn't have to do research. It's not a research body. What it needs to do is to look at what is present in the literature and produce assessments, mostly based on peer-reviewed literature, but not only based on peer-reviewed and technical literature. A very important aspect of the Ipcc production is that it needs to be policy relevant, so interesting for policymakers and decision makers in general, without being policy prescriptive. So it's not for the Ipcc to say, for example, the temperature that we should not go above, overpass, is 2 degrees. Contrary to what has been written and said many times, the Ipcc never said the target is 2 degrees and needs to be 2 degrees. What the Ipcc has said is if you leave the emissions following this trajectory, the temperature will increase approximately so much by approximately this date. This will have approximately these consequences. And if, on the other hand, the emissions follow this alternative scenario, you'll have another set of consequences, another range of temperature values, etc., etc. And then it's policymakers who have to choose what kind of impacts they want to avoid or what they think is possible in terms of climate action. But the Ipcc has never been prescriptive, saying this is the target we need to go for. This is an important clarification, I think. The Ipcc has 3 working groups. The first one deals with the physical aspects of climate change, physical aspects which are increasingly complemented by chemical and biological aspects. The second working group deals with impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. And the third working group deals with elements of solutions, mostly emission reductions, technologies, policies, the economic aspects, the political aspects, etc. And then there is a fourth body which has a different status, which is quite important, and which is the Task Force on Emission Inventories. And it has a very important piece of methodological work which helps the Climate Convention by providing the methods to be used to assess the emissions that different sectors or different countries have. The writing cycle is probably not known enough. This is the explanation why an Ipcc report takes basically 4 years to be written. And it's also related to the intergovernmental nature of the Ipcc, because the I is in Ipcc is not international, it's intergovernmental, and it's quite important. The members of Ipccs are not people, as often reported. You very often see this scientist is a member of Ipcc. That's wrong. The only member of Ipcc are governments. There are 190-something governments members of Ipcc, and they constitute the plenary, which has the most of the power in the Ipcc. And that's such a meeting which met 2 weeks ago in Korea. The plenary, at the beginning of a writing cycle, decides on the table of content of the next report. It might look a small piece of work. Actually, it takes more than a year to reach that stage, which two preparatory meetings, a lot of reflection going on to identify what are the new aspects that would need to be covered in the next report, and what would the balance of importance of the different aspects to cover the structure of the report, etc., so that when the report is ready, it really answers as much as possible the questions policymakers have on the different aspects of climate change. Then the IPCC Bureau appoints the authors who will be writing the report itself. That's based on nominations provided by governments or provided by NGOs, or sometimes it's self-nominations. The last, for this report, for example, we received 3,000 nominations from around the world, covering all disciplines, and with scientists coming from every country almost. And then the Bureau, which is 30 scientists elected by the plenary, and I insist it's 30 scientists, it's not 30 bureaucrats or diplomats or members of governments or whatever, as sometimes reported wrongly. The Bureau appoints then the group of authors who will write the report. For the next report is 830 authors who will be in charge of the next report. And then they start to assess the literature. The first meeting of Working Group 1 is going to meet in 2 weeks from now, I think, in China. And this will be the beginning of the writing cycle for Working Group 1. And after they've written, there is a draft that's submitted to a first round of expert review. The comments come back. The authors have to look at each comment, and each chapter team is gently but efficiently monitored by, or accompanied and monitored by 2, sometimes 3, sometimes even 4 review editors who cannot participate in the writing, they cannot participate in the review. Their mandate is to check that each comment is assessed and handled in an objective manner wherever the comment comes from, whether it comes from the government of Saudi Arabia, the government of Luxembourg, Greenpeace or ExxonMobil. It needs to be handled in an objective manner by the authors, who have to justify for each comment what they do with it, whether they will modify the text in the next draft this way or that way, or whether they think the comment is irrelevant because it's not supported by literature, etc., etc. There are 3 such cycles of review involving, at the end, also the governments. It's combined expert and governments. And at the end, out of that 4-year writing cycle, with thousands of comments that come on the tables of the authors, a total of 90,000 comments for the last report, 90,000 comments. So probably the IPCC report among the most peer-reviewed piece of scientific literature that exists. It doesn't mean that no error take place, as you know, but still the probability of having errors in such documents is quite low, given the sheer volume of information assessed and produced. And then at the end, and then again, there's a new interaction between the governments and the authors. And again, this is a part of the writing cycle which is not known enough. Maybe in part because the plenaries are not open to the media. I'm not sure why it's not open to the media, but the fact is that it's happening behind closed doors, which might feed some of the suspicion that exists about the way the IPCC exists. I would personally favor a little more transparency, but we'll see what happens in the coming few months. So at the end, during that final plenary, the summary policy for policymakers, which was written towards the end of the writing cycle, comes up for discussion and is discussed line by line, word by word, by the representative of the countries present. But it's very important to realize that the last word is with the scientists, with the authors of the main chapters and they have to agree with any change that is suggested by the representative of governments. And it's likely that in the revisions of the procedures that will come in the coming 6 months as a result of the IAC report, that this point will be clarified and made explicit, because now it's only implicit. That is the authors who have the last word. I believe it will be made explicit in the coming writing cycle, before the next plenary in May, when the final decisions on the recommendation of the IAC are taken. So you have an idea of the volume of work that the last report represented, and these are the many reports already produced by Ipcc, 4 complete assessment reports, each time with 3 volumes, 1 for each working group, plus special reports on particular themes. And I think it's important for you to know that in the coming year, which will be actually quite rich for Ipcc production, because there'll be in May the approval of a special report on renewable energy. And at the end of the year, I believe it's November, I'm not sure, October or November, a report on the climate-related extreme events and their relation with disasters and with adaptation policy. So those 2 special reports will be published next year. They are being finalized now. Now, the most recent news around Ipcc was related to that IAC report, which I mentioned, which was published on August 30, and which came up with a number of recommendations. And I'd like to show a few slides on what was decided in Busan, in Korea, as a result of these recommendations. A number of decisions were taken on the spot in Busan, and didn't want to spend a lot of time looking at each of the 22 recommendations from the IAC report. I want to focus on those 4 chapters which I mentioned here. Chapter 2 of the IAC report is talking about the assessment process and the review of the assessment process, and Chapter 3 deals with the treatment of uncertainty. You know, the way the Ipcc describes the level of confidence about one of its conclusions, or the likelihood of a given outcome as a result of climate modeling computation. There was a recommendation about the transparency of the author selection during some of the Ipcc meetings, and this clearly needs improvement. And the task group that was created in Busan, and which has 6 months to prepare decisions, those are the decisions which required a little more time than those who could be taken in Busan. That task group has to prepare options for decisions at the next plenary. And there's a clear intention in Ipcc to reach agreement. I mean, it's not just postponement of the decisions to a later stage. That's not very clear. No, I mean, it's very clear that in 6 months at the next plenary, decisions will be taken for the areas where no decisions could be taken on the spot in Busan. Strengthen the application of procedures and the use on unpublished information or grey literature. There is already a draft updated guidance on the handling of grey literature. What we call grey literature is actually non-peer-reviewed scientific literature. You know, company reports, NGO reports, that kind of information, which is sometimes very useful as complement to peer-reviewed literature, but which has not gone through the filter of peer review, and which thus needs to be used with a little more caution than peer-reviewed literature, even if I can tell you that even peer-reviewed literature needs to be used with caution from time to time. The IAC also emphasized that the full range of scientific views needed to be reflected in the report. Actually, the handling of the full range of scientific views is really at the core of the IPCC principles, which is not there to advocate one idea over another, but which really has to assess the range of views and the range of information available. And what we can do in that area is only reinforce, for example, the role of the review editors, which I mentioned earlier, and which have that important mission of making sure the authors consider each review comments in an objective way. So we will strengthen the application of the existing procedure, strengthen the role of review editors. Another element, an important element, was we finally in Busan agreed, and that was a decision taken in Busan on the spot, because it had been, the time had allowed preparation for this. We now have a protocol for addressing errors, which we didn't have at the beginning of this year. We had no procedure, no clear procedure to correct an error that has been identified after the publication of the report, which explains some of the uneasiness of the IPCC management when those errors came to light. Because, the last word is normally in the IPCC writing cycle, the last word is with the plenary. And there was no procedure to handle errors identified after the last word, quote unquote, had been written in an IPCC plenary. So we now have such a protocol. It will be refined over the coming weeks, finalized over the coming weeks. The draft of that protocol is already on the IPCC website. You can have a look at it. And this will allow a much better handling of errors in the future. Again, on the treatment of uncertainties, I cannot go into the details here, but the IAC came with very detailed recommendations on how to better describe, communicate the uncertainties, and with less confusion between likelihood and confidence for those who know the details. And we actually had, at the beginning of July, before the IAC report was published, and we didn't know they would cover this subject so much in depth. We had a meeting in the US at the beginning of July precisely on this question of the treatment of uncertainties, and that's one of the reasons this decision was also ready. We have revised and updated guidance about the treatment of uncertainties, which is very coherent with the IAC recommendations. So there also we could write, we accepted the IAC recommendations, and not only that, but we had anticipated them, and this is the document which we will give to the authors so that they can handle uncertainties better in the future. Another important subject was the task group on governance and management. There was a clear decision to say that whatever changes are made on this area, that they would only apply as far as the mandate, or the length of the mandate of the elected officials is concerned. They would only apply after the next election, so removing the uncertainty that there was after the IAC report about the mandate of the chair, the co-chairs of the working groups in particular. And the task group has to look at the IAC recommendation. One of them is to create an executive committee to have a better day-to-day management between plenary sessions, to review the responsibilities of key secretariat positions, because there was a recommendation to have an executive director in charge of the secretariat in Geneva. Now it's a secretary who is in charge of the secretariat, and there is a call by the plenary to review the responsibilities of all those who work in the secretariat to see how this review could be considered with the recommendation to establish an executive director. and then to look at the question of the mandate of the elected officials, looking at one of the problems that are raised by the strict implementation of the IAC recommendation, which was only one mandate maximum for the chair and the co-chairs of the working groups, and that is that how do you maintain the continuity then? If everybody is changed at the same time, how can the institutional memory go from one bureau team to the next one? So this will need to be looked at by the contact group, by the task group. A third contact group was created on another subject which could not be handled fully in Busan. There was an agreement that with the IAC recommendation that conflict of interest policy, a rigorous conflict of interest, that's the word used, needed to be developed. And the task group has to prepare options for such a policy, looking and consulting other organizations to see how they do it, because the Ipcc right now doesn't have a conflict of interest policy, and it clearly needs improvement as well. And the last area, very much related to your activities, is on the communication strategy. The IAC report was quite severe, and I believe rightly so, about the lack of communication strategy and the non-efficient communication work that was done by the Ipcc during the last crisis at the beginning of this year. In that area, parenthesis, you should know that only one person is in charge of communication as a professional journalist and communication person at the Secretariat in Geneva. And I can tell you that this is really not enough, especially when that person was at the beginning of this year sick part of the time. So a strategy is clearly needed, but more means to help implementing such a strategy as well. And the task group will certainly come up with recommendations in that area. Also mentioning aspects raised by the IAC report about the variety of spokesperson, the increasing diversity of spokesperson needed in the Ipcc, and clear rules on how to agree on the message to be communicated in an efficient manner when there's a crisis. So this is what I had prepared on Ipcc. Now I have a bunch of slides on the science of Ipcc, but I took so much on Ipcc that on the science I will keep the slides there, but I will keep them ready to be used if there are questions about specific aspects. Now, maybe most of your questions might be on Ipcc, in which case I won't use those slides, but I will still make them available, at least most of them, except one or two for copyright reasons, on your website afterwards. So you can still look at the scientific slides later, but I think it's probably more important to leave enough time at this stage for the interaction and the Q&A part, if that's agreeable to you. Now, if there are no questions, I will continue on the science, but I guess there are some questions. But I'm in your hands.
Thank you very much, Jean-Pascal. I think that's a very interesting presentation that you gave us, especially on the review of the work that you did in South Korea. I have some questions myself, but before I actually shoot at Jean-Pascal, I want to see if there's other questions from the room. Can I see a show of hands of people who actually have some questions? I see somebody there. Anybody else for now? We have micros, and if you could please present yourself, say who you are and which media you represent. Thank you.
My name is Greg Ellis. I'm from Useful Monitors. Mr. van Ypersele, you say that you were not prescriptive about the goal that governments should. Okay.
This one is better. Yeah. The goals you won't tell the governments what they should decide, but there is an agreement to try to limit the global warming to a maximum of 2 degrees by the end of the century. Do you think there is still a chance to reach that goal by the end of the century, or we did already miss the occasion, seeing state of the pledges a few weeks from Cancun? Thank you.
Any other questions for now? Because I would like to assemble a few questions at the same time. In the front here, please.
Rosie Haralambous.
It's working.
It's on.
Rosie Haralambous from the Cyprus Broadcasting Corporation. I'd like your opinion on how much damage you think has been done with all the events of earlier in the year to not only the, excuse me, the credibility of the organisation, but also to the climate change scepticism lobby.
Okay, let's take those two first. Jean-Pascal, the 2 degrees
Yes.
objective, which
Yeah.
I think you actually mentioned that it's not prescriptive from your organization.
That's right. I mean, the IPCC didn't give that objective, but provided the information allowing policymakers to make that choice. Actually, few people know that the choice was not made in Copenhagen last year. It was made in almost 15 years ago by the EU Council of Ministers in June of '96, the Council of Environment Ministers, who had read then the second IPCC report, and on the basis of their reading, they decided to give an interpretation, a numerical interpretation, to the objective of the convention, the ultimate objective of the climate convention, which had been agreed 4 years before in Rio in '92. And this convention says that the ultimate objective of the climate efforts are to stabilize concentrations at a level which prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. So the idea of avoiding dangerous consequences, but there was no number associated to that word dangerous. And it's a political choice to be made. It's not a scientific choice. I mean, look at this diagram which comes from the third assessment report, and which shows for 5 categories of reasons for concern the assessment made by the IPCC authors then about the size of the risk, the importance of the risk in 5 categories. We don't have the time to look at each of them, but you see, and the color scheme is described in the text but understood by anyone who has a driving license, you see that the limit there is somewhere around, for the first 2 categories, around 1.5 degrees in terms of global temperature above the 1990 level, which is used as reference here, which means approximately 2 degrees above the pre-industrial value, which is the value mentioned by the ministers in '96 and taken again in the Copenhagen Accord last year. So this IPCC report kind of justifies after the fact, in the case of this diagram, because this diagram is from 2001, the 2 degree number, at least until then, because if you look at the, this is a zoom on this diagram, if you look at the update diagram based on the AR4, the 4th assessment report, you see using the same categories that the assessment by basically the same scientists provide a temperature limit between the orange and the red, which is about ½ degree lower, which kind of explains the fact that many countries wish a lower target than 2 degrees. Now, to come back to your question on is 2 degrees achievable, you have to look at another diagram from the AR4, which relates the green zone there. Since I have a microphone which move, I can move. The green zone here, this is the temperature at stabilization, and on this axis you have greenhouse gas concentrations at stabilization in terms of CO2 equivalent levels. And if you want to be a little bit above 2 degrees, because this is mostly above 2 degrees, it's not under 2 degrees, you have, in terms of emission scenarios, to be in that green zone here. And what is not well understood up to now is that the zero line on this diagram is here. It's not here. So it means that if you accept of course it's a range, but it means that approximately, even to be just above 2 degrees, you would need to have first 0, then negative global emissions well before the end of the century. So a fortiori, if you wanted to clearly stay below 2 degrees, or even be under 1.5 degrees, you would need to have even lower emissions sooner. So indeed, the challenge is very large, and indeed, it's just a fact that if you compare the present not commitments, but how is it called? The proposals. There's another word, but the pledges. Thank you. That was what I was looking for. If you compare the pledges with the numbers that are implied by that green zone, if one wants to be in that the vicinity of that 2 degrees, the pledges are insufficient, particularly those related to developed countries. Now, the negotiation is not completed, and I guess most negotiators know this. So, I mean, we'll see what is there at the end. But indeed, with the numbers today, most likely the climate would stay above 2 degrees with the present pledges. Now, how much damage has been done to the credibility of the IPCC and climate science in general? Well, actually, that's a research subject in itself. I mean, it's something to research. I mean, who am I, even if I am one of the IPCC vice chairs, to give an answer that's very precise on that question? Probably some damage has been done, at least temporarily, but maybe the fact that the different reports that have been published this year about either the science assessed by IPCC, there were several reports around the climate gate issue, or looking again at the climate science. There was a new report by the Royal Society at the beginning of September. I mean, there were several reports which actually very clearly confirmed that the core of the IPCC conclusions were still absolutely valid and had not been dented, as far as the science is concerned, at all by the criticism on the small mistakes here and there in the report. So, after such heavy criticism and so many independent committees, independent from IPCC, who have, after months of report writing, to come up with the conclusions that the IPCC is fundamentally right on its conclusions, maybe I'm over-optimistic, but after a few months, the credibility of the IPCC could even be increased compared to what it was before. Aren't there some media and communication specialists who say that even negative publicity is good publicity? And so after the waves will have stabilized, it may be that the credibility of the IPCC, when people stand back a little bit and look at what happened in the context also of the reports that came later and confirming the bulk of the IPCC conclusions, it may be that the credibility will have been increased, even if temporarily, of course, the credibility was clearly decreased. But we'll see. And it's a research subject in itself, so I may be totally wrong. I mean, it's only an hypothesis. Now, what damage has this done to climate skepticism? Well, first of all, I'd like to say that I don't like so much this expression of skepticism in the way it's used, because I believe that all scientists need to be skeptics. I mean, it's their jobs. We're not well paid, but we're paid to be skeptics and to question what we find, what we read, and not to take for granted indefinitely what we read and what we discover. I mean, if Einstein had not questioned even something as fundamental as the law of gravity, which looked as something really absolutely solid and impossible to question, he would not have invented the theory of relativity, for example. So, to be skeptic is a good attitude in science. Now, the way climate skepticism is understood usually is a bit different, but I wanted to make the point that I don't see why the those who criticize IPCC sometimes with bad intentions have the monopoly of skepticism. I think skepticism is a very good attitude for scientists to have in general.
Thank you, Jean-Pascal. There are more questions, one in the back and then one in front here. First, go in the back, please.
Hello, my name is Eva Krukowska. I'm from Bloomberg News. I've got actually two questions on monitoring and verifying emissions. First of all, are current methods and ways to measure pollution in the air sufficient? I mean, can we be really sure that 1 ton of reduced emissions is really 1 ton? Or that 1 ton of carbon traded on the EU or UN markets is really 1 ton? And what do you think will be the biggest challenge in terms of verification and monitoring of emissions as negotiators prepare for Cancun? Thank you.
In front here. Yeah. Okay.
This is Ricardo Garcia from newspaper Público in Portugal. You said that if the IPCC had not been created, policymakers would have trouble to find their way through thousands of scientific papers. Does this mean that we need other IPCCs for biodiversity or for the oceans or for air pollution and all the environmental problems?
Jean-Pascal?
Yes, I'll try to give shorter answers, then we can have other questions. On the monitoring and verification, I'm not a specialist of the methodologies for inventories, and actually the report of the task force on inventories are even thicker than the IPCC scientific reports, and I certainly don't know everything that's present there, but I think it very much depends on the kind of emissions. I mean, for example, emissions coming from the burning of fossil fuel are quite easy to monitor and to quantify, because 1 kilogram of carbon contained in that fossil fuel is going to provide 3.7 kilogram of CO2, and that's a law of chemistry, and then as long as you know how many carbon is present in the fossil fuel you burn, you automatically know the amount of CO2, and then it's a matter of economical statistics. If you know how much coal, oil and gas has been burned in a country or in a particular industry or sector, you automatically know how much CO2 has been emitted. Now, in another area, to take a completely different way, it's much more tricky, is in the area of land use and changes in soil usage and forestry. There, the uncertainty is much larger, and it's much more difficult to estimate the amount of carbon that's either stored or released by the soil or the vegetation itself. So you really need to look at the problem sector by sector, which is why the report of the task force on inventories are so thick. Now, the challenge of MRV, monitoring, reporting, verification in Cancun, are probably not so much technical, even if in the area of forestry there are many technical challenges. It's probably more in the area of trust and the area of politics, because, you know, in Annex 1 countries, the inventories are checked by international teams, and I've seen one at work very closely when the inspection of Belgium emission was made a few years ago. It's very seriously done, and so if you agree on the principle of such a verification, you then have results which are accepted by everyone. But presently, all countries don't accept that in the climate negotiations today. So I mean, that's not a technical problem. It's a political problem. IPCC. Well, the answer there is easy. A decision has been made, if I understand well, at least in the biodiversity area, to create a body very much inspired. I mean, it's not exactly the same, but it's very much inspired by IPCC for biodiversity. And they are really using the IPCC as a model. And you can take a counter example, and that has not been created yet. It will probably go through the next UN General Assembly in December, and if it's confirmed, then it will be created probably sometime next year. A counter example of a process where you didn't have an intergovernmental process, even if there was a scientific assessment, and everybody forgot that piece of that very important, very interesting report, is the Millennium ecosystem assessment, which required the work also of 100 scientists for several years, and which is totally forgotten today. And probably one of the reasons is that, contrary to the IPCC, it was a job made among scientists, and there were the stakeholders and the governments were not involved at all in the process. In the IPCC, they are involved at the beginning and at the end, and so they cannot claim afterwards that they ignore the content of the report, because they were part of the meeting which approved the summary for policymakers. So that's a key characteristic of the IPCC, and probably one of the reasons why some are trying to copy it in other areas. And it's taking place for biodiversity for sure. Yeah.
Thank you, Jean-Pascal. 5 minutes left, so 1 or 2 questions more, if possible. One in the middle there. Yeah.
Eric Struy from El Comercio from Peru. There are a lot of journalists, scientists who think we journalists are failing getting the message passed to the public about climate change and biodiversity. What is the main criticism you would address to us?
That's a difficult one. Be polite, but be blunt, please.
Yeah, sure. I've worked with probably hundreds of journalists over the last 30 years, and I've always, almost always met. I've met a few exceptions this year, I must say, but I've always met people who were very interested and who had a lot of constraints in their job. And I think what's probably needed a little more is a little more time, and I'm sorry I have to leave in 3 minutes because that's not very good for what I'm saying, a little more time to have a dialogue between, so that the two professions, I mean media people and scientists on the other side, understand a little better the constraints and the context in which each work, so that a little more of a common language can be or elements of a common language can be developed between both professions, because that's probably one of the aspects which is missing, is that the language used by many scientists is I mean, they would like to, to publish, to have you publish 20 pages of nuances and caveats. Say yes, but if this and this, then it's not exactly this which happened, but that. And I mean, you cannot sell because you have to sell at some point any problem. Most of you, I guess, any paper. If the information is not packaged in a way that will be read, and I mean this needs to be understood by scientists as well. So I mean more sessions like this. I mean I think that what you are doing here is very important to improve the quality of reporting in this area, and I'm only sorry I cannot stay a little longer to interact a little more with you. I would probably learn a lot from you as well. Actually, on Wednesday afternoon, and this is clashing with your meeting, but Wednesday afternoon and Thursday, the whole day, in case some of you want to stay a little longer in Brussels, there's a very important, very interesting symposium on climate controversies, which will take place in Brussels with a few specialists of the questions you raised. I mean, has the credibility been damaged? Who is behind those attempts to decredibilize, etc.? And this will take place in Brussels Wednesday afternoon and Thursday, and I'm sure there's a way to attend if you're interested.
Okay, thank you very much, Jean-Pascal. I think we have to leave you here because your students are probably already waiting.
I still have 2 minutes on my watch.
Okay. We can still one more question if you want. No other questions? There's one.
Yes,
yes, please.
The Lithuanian news agency. It's a very short question. Could you assess the Climategate scandal impact to the decision-making process, political decision-making process?
Well, it's a little bit like the question from the lady here and on the first row. It's actually difficult to assess. You know, it would require some scientific work, and it's very difficult to measure. How I mean, you can of course answer subjectively easily. Yes, you can say yes, it damaged a lot, and the proof of that is that Copenhagen was a failure, and Copenhagen was just after the climate gate. So this is the proof that climate gate caused the failure of Copenhagen. I mean, of course, things are much more complicated than that. Maybe it played a very little role in Copenhagen. I'm not even convinced it played a significant role. I am sure it was hoped by some that it would decredibilize the process and therefore decrease the political will to address the problem. But I'm not convinced at all that this is really the main reason behind the difficulties in Copenhagen and the difficulties now. I mean, you had the financial crisis, the economic crisis. I mean, you have so many other factors. You had the way the meeting in Copenhagen was managed, which was not ideal, and which has nothing to do with climate science or Ipcc. And all those factors have played probably a much more important role than the attacks on climate science and Ipcc. But probably it had. And in some country, it has some effect on the political will to address the issue. But it's difficult to measure.
Thank you very much, Jean-Pascal. So we'll leave you now, and
thank you.
I'll see you probably one of the next debates. But for now, thank you very much, and let's have a big applause for Jean-Pascal. Thank you.